Welcome to a journey into one of the most disturbing and carefully concealed incidents in New Mexico territorial history. Before we begin, I invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and whether you're experiencing this account alone or with others. We're curious about how these forgotten testimonies reach different places and circumstances across our world. In the unforgiving high desert of New Mexico territory, beneath the endless expanse of star-drunk skies in 1863, a community calling itself Shepherd's Rest became the stage for acts so profane that federal authorities would spend decades ensuring they remained buried in classified archives. This is the documented account of what territorial records cryptically refer to as the Sangre de Cristo aberration, a series of events surrounding a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Thorne and the 73 souls who followed him into damnation. The year was 1863. The New Mexico territory had been under United States control for less than 20 years, wrested from Mexican authority during the war that ended in 1848. The Civil War raged in distant states, drawing attention and resources away from the vast, empty spaces of the Southwest. In this context of limited oversight and territorial uncertainty, something ancient and malevolent found the perfect opportunity to emerge from the shadows where it had waited for centuries. It was against this backdrop of cultural collision and governmental neglect that Ezekiel Thorne arrived in the remote valley known to the Apache as Tsech-Ili, the place where the earth bleeds, approximately 40 miles northeast of what is now Las Vegas, New Mexico. The Apache name itself carries layers of meaning that territorial authorities failed to comprehend. In the complex linguistic traditions of the Jicarilla Apache, Tsech-Ili referred not merely to the red iron oxide stains that colored the canyon walls, but to a spiritual wound in the earth itself, a place where the barrier between worlds had been damaged beyond repair. Thorne appeared in Santa Fe in the spring of 1862, arriving on the westbound stage from Independence, Missouri, though subsequent investigation would reveal that no passenger matching his description had purchased passage under that name. According to territorial records maintained by Governor Henry Connolly's administration, Thorne presented credentials identifying him as a minister of the Methodist Episcopal Church, along with letters of introduction from church authorities in Kansas City and Lawrence. These documents, when examined decades later during a federal investigation conducted by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, proved to be masterful forgeries created with techniques that would not be developed by professional counterfeiters for another 20 years. The forged nature of Thorne's credentials was not discovered until 1889, when a fire at the Methodist Episcopal headquarters in Kansas City destroyed many original records. While attempting to reconstruct damaged files, church archivists discovered that the letterheads and seals allegedly used to authenticate Thorne's credentials had never existed. The signatures purportedly belonging to church officials were found to be fabrications so perfect that they included details of handwriting quirks and ink formulations that the actual officials had used, despite Thorne having no documented contact with these individuals. The man himself was described in multiple contemporary accounts as possessing an almost supernatural magnetism that seemed to affect not only humans but animals, and even the natural environment around him. Maria Sandoval, whose detailed diary was discovered in 1923 during renovations to an old Santa Fe residence, wrote extensively of her encounters with Thorne at the Plaza Market. "Never have I seen a man whose very presence seemed to command attention without effort. Tall and lean as a desert pine, with eyes the color of winter sky that seemed to hold depths no human gaze should possess. His hands moved as if conducting invisible music, and when he gestured, the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibilities I dare not name." Sandoval's observations continued with details that would prove prophetic. When he spoke of salvation, even the Apache women stopped their trading to listen, though they understood not a word of English. Yet their faces showed comprehension of something deeper than language, and I observed several make the old signs against evil spirits while nodding in apparent agreement with his words. The dogs in the plaza, normally aggressive toward strangers, approached him with the submissive posture they display only toward pack leaders, while the horses grew restless and whinnied in harmonics that seemed to answer his voice. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, the territorial physician who would later play a crucial role in documenting the Shepherd's Rest incident, recorded his first impression of Thorne in his professional journal, a document that was sealed by federal authorities until 1963. The Reverend Thorne possesses remarkable oratorical gifts that extend beyond mere charisma into realms that challenge medical understanding. His pupils remain consistently dilated regardless of lighting conditions, a phenomenon I have observed only in cases of severe brain trauma or exposure to certain botanical toxins. Yet he displays none of the other symptoms associated with such conditions. Dr. Whitmore's medical training led him to make observations that others might have dismissed as mere eccentricity. Most unsettling is his apparent ability to diagnose medical conditions through casual observation. During our first meeting, he correctly identified a kidney stone I had been suffering from in private, described the exact location and approximate size, and suggested a treatment regimen that proved remarkably effective. When questioned about his medical knowledge, he merely smiled and quoted Ezekiel 34:16, "I will seek the lost, and bring again that which was driven away, and will bind up that which was broken, and will strengthen that which was sick." The doctor's journal entries reveal growing unease as he documented additional encounters with Thorne throughout the summer of 1862. The Reverend displays an unsettling habit of speaking to individuals as if he possesses intimate knowledge of their private struggles, fears, and desires. I have observed him approach complete strangers and immediately begin discussions of their most personal concerns with an accuracy that would be impressive in a longtime confidant. When questioned about his methods, he quotes scripture with mechanical precision, while his eyes suggest awareness of information that no human mind should contain. Thorne spent 6 months in Santa Fe, establishing his reputation and gathering followers through a combination of apparent miracles, prophetic accuracy, and an ability to provide exactly what each potential convert needed most desperately. His preaching style incorporated elements from various religious traditions in ways that territorial authorities found increasingly difficult to categorize or control. A letter from Father Miguel Cordova to the Archbishop of Santa Fe, discovered in diocesan archives during renovations in 1941, expressed mounting concern about Thorne's growing influence and the theological implications of his teachings. This man who calls himself a minister speaks of Christ and salvation, yet his words carry undertones that trouble my sleep and disturb my prayers. He promises his followers not merely redemption from sin, but transformation into beings of higher purpose, entities that transcend the limitations of mortal flesh. Father Cordova's letter continued with observations that would prove remarkably prescient. The people are drawn to him like iron filings to a lodestone, abandoning not only their traditional religious observances, but also their rational skepticism to hear him speak of ascending beyond mortal limitations. His gatherings begin with familiar hymns and scripture readings, but progress toward recitations in languages I cannot identify. Yesterday I witnessed him place his hands upon Elena Martinez, a woman afflicted with palsy since childhood, and I swear before the Blessed Virgin that her trembling ceased instantly and completely. The priest's account included details that he struggled to rationalize within his theological framework. Yet when the woman looked at me afterward, her eyes held a recognition of something I dare not name, and she spoke with a voice that seemed to carry harmonics impossible for human vocal cords to produce. She thanked me for my concern, but explained that she now served a higher purpose that required her to transcend the limitations of her former existence. The other parishioners who witnessed this miracle praised God, but I confess that what I observed seemed less like divine healing and more like replacement. The phenomenon Father Cordova described would become a recurring theme in accounts of Thorne's ministry throughout the territory. Multiple witnesses documented not only apparent healings, but also profound personality changes in those who received Thorne's intervention. People who had been known for their skepticism became fanatically devoted overnight. Individuals previously noted for their emotional reserve began speaking in rapturous terms about visions and communications with entities they could describe only in fragmentary, often contradictory terms. Sarah Henderson, wife of territorial surveyor Marcus Henderson, wrote extensively to her sister Margaret in Missouri about her experiences attending Thorne's gatherings. These letters, preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives, provide detailed civilian accounts of Thorn's methods and their effects on the local population. Dearest Margaret, I must share with you the most extraordinary occurrence. The preacher I mentioned in my previous letter called me by my full Christian name, though we had never been introduced, and spoke with perfect accuracy of the child we lost 3 winters past. He mentioned details of little Samuel's final moments that I had shared with no one except Marcus, describing even the way the fever made him reach toward the window, as if seeing something beyond our perception. Henderson's account continued with descriptions that revealed the calculating nature of Thorn's approach to potential converts. When I wept at these memories, he placed his hand upon my shoulder, and I felt a warmth that seemed to penetrate not merely my flesh, but the very essence of my being. The sensation was unlike anything in my experience, as if every cell in my body was being gently awakened to possibilities I had never imagined. He told me that in the community he was called to establish, death would hold no dominion over those who truly understood their purpose in creation. The letter revealed how Thorn tailored his message to each individual's deepest needs and fears. He explained that those who joined him in this sacred work would find reunion not only with lost loved ones, but with aspects of themselves that had been suppressed by the limitations of ordinary existence. He spoke of humanity's true potential, claiming that we are but larvae waiting to emerge as beings of light and purpose. I confess, dear sister, that despite my Methodist upbringing and Marcus's scientific skepticism, I find myself powerfully drawn to these promises. By autumn of 1862, Thorn had assembled a core group of approximately 30 followers, drawn from diverse backgrounds in a manner that reflected his supernatural ability to identify and exploit individual vulnerabilities. The composition of this group was unusual for the territory, where racial and cultural divisions typically prevented such integration. Yet Thorn seemed to possess an uncanny ability to transcend these barriers through means that observers struggled to explain. The group included prominent Anglo settlers like the Hendersons and Dr. Whitmore's own laboratory assistant, but also several Hispanic families who had abandoned their Catholic traditions, 2 Apache individuals who had adopted Christian names but retained their tribal knowledge of the local landscape, and even a Chinese merchant named Li Wei, who had been ostracized by both white and Hispanic communities, until Thorn welcomed him with apparent genuine acceptance. Dr. Whitmore noted in his journal that Thorn seemed to communicate with individuals, regardless of their native language, through methods that defied conventional understanding. I observed the Reverend Thorn speaking at length with Juan Marquez, a man whose English vocabulary consists of perhaps 50 words related to his work as a blacksmith. Yet their conversation proceeded for nearly an hour, with Marquez nodding and responding as if he understood every nuance of Thorn's most complex theological concepts. When I inquired about this afterward, Marquez looked puzzled by my question and said simply that the preacher spoke directly to his heart, bypassing the confusion of words entirely. Similar observations were recorded regarding Thorn's interactions with Li Wei, who spoke minimal English and no Spanish, yet participated fully in theological discussions that required sophisticated understanding of Christian doctrine and metaphysical concepts. Apache tribal members later interviewed by federal investigators claimed that Thorn spoke their language with perfect fluency, despite having no documented exposure to Apache linguistic traditions. In October 1862, Thorn announced to his followers that he had received a divine vision directing him to establish a community in the wilderness, where they could pursue a purer form of worship away from the corrupting influences of territorial society. The location he described matched precisely the Apache's Tsehili, despite his claiming no knowledge of local tribal traditions or the geographical features that would make the valley recognizable to someone who had never visited the area. According to Apache oral history recorded by ethnographer Dr. Catherine Morales during extensive interviews conducted between 1935 and 1937, the valley had been considered cursed since ancient times, with tribal memories extending back through generations that spoke of disturbances that predated European contact by centuries. Joseph Crow Feather, an elder whose great-grandfather had been present during the last tribal ceremonies conducted near the valley, provided details that proved remarkably consistent with later federal findings. My great-grandfather spoke of that place with the fear reserved for locations where the natural order had been violated. He said the spirits there were hungry and ancient, that they had been disturbed by something that should have remained buried deeper than the roots of mountains. No Apache would hunt in that valley, would not even pass through if any other path existed between destinations. Crow Feather's account included specific details about the geological anomalies that made the valley distinctive. The bleeding stones were not natural, great-grandfather said. They marked places where the earth itself had been wounded by forces from the time before time, when different stars ruled the sky and beings of terrible knowledge walked among our ancestors. The springs that fed the valley came from depths where water should not exist, and the animals that drank from them sometimes changed in ways that forced our warriors to hunt them as abominations. The elders' testimony revealed that tribal avoidance of the valley was based on specific incidents that had occurred within living memory. In the time of my grandfather's youth, a war party pursued Apache enemies into the canyon during the season when the Pleiades rise at dawn. They found their enemies, but also something else. 3 warriors returned from that pursuit, but they were no longer entirely themselves. They spoke of visions that came not in dreams but in waking moments, of voices that promised great power to those who would serve intelligences older than the earth. According to tribal records maintained through oral tradition, the affected warriors had been isolated from the rest of the tribe after they began displaying behaviors that tribal shamans recognized as signs of spiritual contamination. They could see events occurring at great distances, predict weather changes with perfect accuracy, and communicate with each other without speaking. But they had lost something essential, some quality that made them recognizably Apache. The shamans said they had been touched by the Hungry Ones, beings that fed on human consciousness and transformed their servants into instruments of alien will. The valley itself was a geological anomaly that had attracted scientific interest even before Thorne's arrival. Located in a region where such formations should not exist according to standard geological principles, it consisted of a roughly oval depression, approximately 3 miles long and half a mile wide, enclosed by red sandstone cliffs that rose nearly vertical for several hundred feet. The most distinctive feature was the presence of numerous iron oxide deposits that created dramatic red staining on the rock formations, giving the appearance that the stone itself was bleeding. What made the valley truly unusual was its hydrological system. A seasonal stream ran through its center, fed by springs that emerged from the canyon walls at seemingly random points throughout the year. Geological surveys conducted in the 1920s revealed that these springs drew from an underground water table that should not exist at that elevation and in that geological formation. The water itself showed mineral compositions that included trace elements not found naturally in the surrounding region. Dr. Whitmore, who visited the site in November 1862 at Thorne's invitation, described it in his journal as a place of stark and terrible beauty, yet possessed of an atmosphere that affects both human consciousness and animal behavior in ways that challenge rational explanation. My horse, normally steady and obedient, refused to enter the canyon until blindfolded, and throughout my stay, I observed no birds or small mammals, despite abundant water and vegetation that should have supported thriving wildlife populations. The doctor's scientific training led him to document environmental anomalies that others might have dismissed. The silence in the valley is so complete it becomes almost tangible, as if sound waves themselves are absorbed by some property of the rock formations. Even my own voice seemed muffled and distorted, often producing echoes that returned with subtly altered tonal qualities. Temperature measurements revealed inexplicable variations, with certain areas remaining consistently warmer than surrounding locations, despite receiving identical solar exposure. Why? Thorne's followers began construction of their community in late 1862, building structures from native stone and timber hauled from distant forests at considerable expense and effort. The labor itself was unusual, with work proceeding according to schedules that followed astronomical rather than practical considerations. Construction occurred primarily during specific lunar phases, with certain tasks reserved for periods when particular star configurations were visible in the night sky. The settlement they created was unlike any other in the territory, both in its physical layout and in the architectural principles that governed its design. Rather than the typical grid pattern of frontier towns, Shepherd's Rest was arranged in 3 concentric circles around a central plaza, with the precise positioning of each structure determined by complex geometric relationships that served no apparent practical purpose. The outer circle consisted of family dwellings, constructed with unusual attention to acoustic properties. Each home incorporated design elements that created specific sound resonances, with carefully calculated ceiling heights, wall thicknesses, and window placements that seemed intended to amplify certain frequencies while dampening others. The middle circle contained workshops and storage buildings, but also structures whose purpose remained unclear to outside observers. The inner circle held only one building, a large structure that served as both church and meeting hall, but whose architecture incorporated elements that challenged conventional understanding of structural engineering. This central building was Thorne's particular obsession, and its construction revealed knowledge of advanced architectural principles that seemed far beyond what a frontier preacher should possess. According to construction accounts preserved in the diary of craftsman William Morrison, a skilled carpenter who had worked on territorial government buildings in Santa Fe, Thorne provided detailed architectural plans that demonstrated extraordinary sophistication. The Reverend's drawings showed precise measurements and engineering specifications that would challenge an experienced architect trained in the finest Eastern schools. The foundation required excavation to precise depths, calculated according to mathematical principles I could not understand, with chambers and passages that seemed to serve no obvious structural purpose. Morrison's diary reveals his growing unease with the construction process as work progressed. The Reverend insisted that every measurement be exact to the quarter inch, with angles calculated to mathematical precision that required instruments I had never seen before. When I questioned the necessity of such precision for a frontier church, he explained that the building would serve purposes beyond ordinary worship, that it was designed to facilitate communication with intelligences that required perfect harmonic resonance to manifest their presence. The most unusual aspect of the central building was its basement level, which extended deep into the bedrock and connected to natural cave systems through excavations that required techniques Morrison had never encountered. The lower chambers were excavated according to plans that showed intimate knowledge of the underground geology, with passages that connected to natural caverns through openings positioned with mathematical precision. The Reverend personally directed all work in these areas, often descending into the excavations with surveying instruments and making calculations that filled numerous notebooks with symbols and diagrams I could not interpret. Morrison documented the acoustic properties of these underground spaces with the fascination of a craftsman encountering techniques beyond his understanding. The chambers create sound effects that defy explanation. Voices spoken in whispers carry clearly between rooms separated by solid stone walls, while normal conversation sometimes produces no audible sound at all. The Reverend tested these effects extensively, having various workers speak specific words and phrases in different locations while he recorded the results in his notebooks. When I mentioned the strange acoustic properties, he smiled and explained that the design would help his flock hear the true voice of the divine, unfiltered by earthly interference. By spring of 1863, Shepherd's Rest housed 73 residents, including men, women, and children ranging in age from infants to elderly grandparents. The community appeared to thrive in ways that impressed the few outside visitors who were permitted to enter, but these surface appearances concealed transformations that would have horrified those same observers had they understood their true nature. The community's apparent prosperity was documented in reports filed by territorial officials who conducted mandatory census inspections. Tax assessor Robert Crawford noted that Shepherd's Rest displayed remarkable evidence of successful agricultural development and craft production, with crop yields that exceed regional averages despite challenging growing conditions, and manufactured goods of quality comparable to Eastern industrial centers. What Crawford's official reports failed to mention, but which appeared in his private correspondence discovered decades later, were observations that disturbed him sufficiently to request reassignment to other territories. The residents work with an efficiency that borders on the supernatural, often beginning tasks simultaneously without apparent communication and completing complex projects with a coordination that suggests shared consciousness rather than mere cooperation. Children demonstrate knowledge and skills far beyond their years, while adults display physical capabilities that challenge belief in normal human limitations. Dr. Whitmore made several visits to the settlement in his capacity as territorial physician, and maintained detailed medical records that were immediately classified upon discovery by federal authorities. His journal entries from this period reveal a gradual shift from professional curiosity to mounting alarm as he documented changes in the community's residents that defied medical explanation. The residents of Shepherd's Rest display remarkable health and vitality that exceeds anything in my medical experience. Childhood diseases that claim numerous lives throughout the territory seem unable to establish themselves in the community. Injuries heal with unprecedented speed, often leaving no trace within days of occurrence. Most remarkably, several elderly residents show signs of age reversal, with improved posture, restored hair color, and elimination of chronic conditions that had afflicted them for years. The doctor's medical training led him to document physiological changes that he struggled to explain within conventional scientific frameworks. All residents display the same unusual pupil dilation I first observed in Reverend Thorne, regardless of lighting conditions or time of day. Their reflexes have been enhanced to levels that exceed normal human parameters, with reaction times that approach the theoretical limits of nervous system transmission. Most unsettling, several residents demonstrate sensory capabilities that challenge understanding of human perception, accurately identifying objects and events beyond the range of normal sight, hearing, or touch. Dr. Whitmore's journals reveal his growing realization that the changes in Shepherd's Rest residents were not improvements, but alterations that represented something fundamentally different from normal human development. During my examination of the Henderson children, I discovered anatomical modifications that cannot be explained by natural growth processes. Sarah, age 10, displays additional neural pathways in her brainstem that appear to have developed since her arrival at the community. Her brother Michael shows bone density increases that provide enhanced physical strength, but also suggest adaptation to environmental pressures that do not exist in normal human experience. The community's isolation was carefully maintained through strict protocols that Thorne claimed were necessary to protect his followers from the spiritual contamination of territorial society. Contact with the outside world was limited to carefully controlled trading expeditions, always conducted by small groups who returned with necessary supplies, but minimal information about their experiences beyond the valley. These trading missions followed patterns that seemed designed more to maintain appearances than to meet practical needs. Maria Santos, whose letters to her sister in Albuquerque provide some of the few contemporary accounts of daily life in Shepherd's Rest, describe the community's relationship with the outside world in terms that reveal its artificial nature. Our brothers and sisters who venture forth to obtain supplies speak little of their experiences in the corrupted world beyond our valley. They return with materials we require for our sacred work, but also with expressions of relief to be once again in the presence of divine truth. The Reverend explains that exposure to the outside world is increasingly difficult for those of us who have begun the transformation, that our enhanced spiritual sensitivity makes contact with unawakened humanity painful and disorienting. Santos's letters reveal the psychological conditioning that made isolation seem desirable rather than restrictive. I confess that I no longer feel curiosity about news from the territory or events in the broader world. Such concerns seem petty and distracting compared to the great work we perform under the Reverend's guidance. The children especially have adapted to our separated existence, often expressing confusion when reminded of their previous lives, and gratitude that they were brought to understanding before the corruption of ordinary existence could permanently damage their spiritual development. The educational practices at Shepherd's Rest represented one of the most disturbing aspects of the community's operations. Thorne conducted regular sessions with the community's children in the basement levels of the central building, sessions that sometimes lasted for hours and produced dramatic changes in the participants' knowledge, behavior, and apparent cognitive capabilities. These educational sessions followed schedules that corresponded to astronomical events rather than conventional pedagogical principles. Children were divided into groups based not on age, but on criteria that seemed to relate to their progress in what Thorne called awakening to higher consciousness. The youngest children, some barely able to walk, participated in activities that included complex pattern recognition exercises and exposure to sounds and images that produced measurable changes in brain function. Thomas Fletcher, whose family joined the community in early 1863, documented his growing concerns about these educational methods in a private journal that he concealed within the walls of his dwelling. This journal was not discovered until archaeological excavation of the site in 1955, providing crucial insight into the community's internal dynamics during its final months. My daughter Sarah, age 10, has begun speaking in languages that bear no resemblance to any human tongue I have encountered, claiming the Reverend has taught her the communication methods used by beings of pure consciousness. These vocalizations produce physical effects in those who hear them, including alterations in heart rate, blood pressure, and brainwave patterns that I have learned to recognize through careful observation. Fletcher's journal reveals his desperate attempts to understand what was happening to his child while maintaining the appearance of willing participation. Yesterday I discovered Sarah drawing geometric patterns of extraordinary complexity, accompanied by symbols that seem to shift and writhe when observed directly, as if they exist partially in dimensions beyond normal visual perception. When I questioned her about these images, she looked at me with eyes that held knowledge no child should possess, and explained that the patterns were instructions for awakening what she called the sleeping geometry within human consciousness. The deeper teachings that Fletcher referenced became increasingly central to life at Shepherd's Rest as 1863 progressed. Thorne introduced esoteric elements into the community's religious practices through a gradual process that prevented residents from recognizing the extent of their deviation from Christian orthodoxy until the transformation was irreversible. These teachings suggested that humanity was on the verge of an evolutionary leap that would transform the species into something capable of serving intelligences whose existence transcended physical reality. According to Maria Santos's increasingly disturbing letters, Thorne claimed that the residents of Shepherd's Rest had been chosen to serve as the vanguard of this transformation. The Reverend reveals more each week about our true purpose in creation. We are not merely seeking personal salvation, but serving as instruments through which beings of infinite consciousness will reclaim their rightful influence over earthly affairs. These entities, whom he calls the ancient shepherds, have watched humanity's development for millennia, guiding our evolution toward the moment when we could serve as suitable vessels for their return to active participation in material reality. Santos's letters document the progressive conditioning that made these concepts seem not only believable, but desirable to the community's residents. The ancient shepherds offer knowledge and power beyond human imagining, the ability to transcend the limitations of mortal existence and participate in cosmic purposes that extend across vast reaches of time and space. Some among our number have already begun to demonstrate abilities that would have seemed miraculous in our former lives. Mrs. Henderson can perceive events occurring at great distances. Young Benjamin Morrison communicates directly with the creatures of the valley, and all of us feel the presence of vast intelligences that guide our thoughts and actions toward perfect harmony with divine will. Dr. Whitmore's visits to Shepherd's Rest became less frequent as 1863 progressed, partly due to increasing professional obligations in Santa Fe, but primarily because of his growing horror at the changes he observed in the community's residents. His journal entries from the final months before the settlement's disappearance reveal his mounting desperation to document what he increasingly recognized as a threat to human consciousness itself. The transformation in the residents of Shepherd's Rest has accelerated beyond anything in medical literature. Physical changes now include not only the uniform pupil dilation, but also a peculiar luminosity to the skin that becomes visible in darkness, enhanced reflexes that approach superhuman levels, and coordination between individuals that suggests shared nervous system function rather than mere behavioral conditioning. The doctor's scientific training led him to document phenomena that challenged his understanding of biological possibility. Most disturbing are the behavioral modifications that indicate fundamental alterations in consciousness itself. All residents now move with perfect synchronization, even when separated by considerable distances, often beginning tasks simultaneously without apparent communication or completing each other's sentences with precision that suggests access to shared thoughts rather than merely compatible thinking patterns. Dr. Whitmore's final detailed observations of Shepherd's Rest, recorded during his last official visit in July 1863, provide crucial documentation of the community's condition immediately before its disappearance. When I questioned Reverend Thorne about these phenomena, he welcomed my scientific perspective and invited me to observe the evening prayers in the Great Hall. What I witnessed challenged every principle of medical science and rational understanding of human behavior. The doctor's account of this observation session reveals the true nature of what was occurring at Shepherd's Rest. The congregation had arranged itself in precise geometric patterns that seemed to maximize acoustic resonance within the chamber. Families were separated, with individuals positioned according to calculations that Thorne consulted from notebooks filled with complex mathematical formulas. The prayers themselves consisted largely of syllables that bore no resemblance to any human language, repeated in harmonics that created acoustic effects I struggle to describe scientifically. Dr. Whitmore documented the physical and psychological effects of these sessions with medical precision, despite his growing horror. The sound seemed to penetrate not merely the auditory system, but the entire nervous system, inducing alterations in brain function that were immediately apparent in the participants' behavior and physiological responses. Heart rates synchronized across the entire congregation, breathing patterns matched precisely, and brainwave activity, as measured by the portable electroencephalograph I had brought for other research, showed identical patterns in all subjects tested. The doctor's journal continues with observations that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Most disturbing was my own response to the acoustic phenomena. Despite my scientific training and awareness of what was occurring, I found myself joining the recitation involuntarily, speaking syllables I did not recognize in harmonies that seemed to emerge from some unconscious knowledge I did not know I possessed. The experience was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, offering sensations of expanded consciousness while producing the distinct impression that my individual identity was being subsumed into something vastly larger and fundamentally alien. By August 1863, territorial authorities had begun receiving reports that prompted immediate concern at the federal level. These reports, compiled from various sources including tax assessors, military patrols, and traders who had contact with Shepherd's Rest residents, painted a picture of a community that had evolved beyond the boundaries of normal human society. Captain James Morrison of the Territorial Militia filed detailed reports describing encounters with community members who had traveled to Las Vegas and other settlements for supplies. These reports, classified immediately upon receipt, described behavior patterns that suggested fundamental alterations in human consciousness and physiology. The individuals in question displayed coordination and behavioral synchronization that cannot be explained by normal social conditioning. They moved in perfect unison despite being engaged in separate commercial activities, completed each other's sentences with supernatural precision, and demonstrated knowledge of private conversations and events that they should have had no means of obtaining. Captain Morrison's military training led him to focus on potential security implications of these observations. When questioned about their unusual conduct, the subjects responded in unison using identical phrasing and vocal intonation, stating that they were following the will of their shepherd who had taught them to function as one body in service to higher purposes. Most concerning was their response to inquiries about territorial law enforcement activities and military movements in the region. They displayed detailed knowledge of classified operations and personnel assignments that suggested access to intelligence sources beyond normal civilian capabilities. The captain's reports included specific incidents that prompted immediate federal intervention. 7 individuals who had joined the Shepherd's Rest community in recent months were not among the group conducting business in Las Vegas, despite previous reports confirming their presence in the settlement. When inquiries were made about their current whereabouts, the community representatives responded in perfect unison that these individuals had ascended to serve in higher capacities and were no longer bound by earthly limitations requiring physical presence in our current dimensional framework. Federal authorities recognized the implications of these reports immediately. The missing persons represented individuals with valuable skills and knowledge, including a territorial surveyor who had access to classified geographical information, and a former military communications specialist whose disappearance had already triggered security concerns at the War Department. The case of Gerald Whitman, the missing surveyor, exemplifies the federal government's growing alarm about Shepherd's Rest. Whitman had been conducting classified mapping operations related to potential railway routes and mineral deposits when he joined Thorne's community. His disappearance represented not only a personal tragedy, but a significant security breach that could compromise territorial development plans. Judge William Bradford, who presided over territorial legal matters, documented his attempts to investigate these disappearances in official correspondence with Governor Connolly and federal authorities in Washington. His letters, preserved in National Archives collections, reveal the legal and practical complications surrounding any attempt to address the Shepherd's Rest situation through conventional means. The legal complications surrounding the Shepherd's Rest community exceed any precedent in territorial jurisprudence. The settlement claims religious autonomy under territorial statutes that protect freedom of worship, making direct intervention legally problematic, despite mounting evidence of activities that transcend the boundaries of legitimate religious practice. However, the documented pattern of missing persons, combined with reports of increasingly aberrant behavior from community members, suggests criminal activities that may fall under federal rather than territorial jurisdiction. Judge Bradford's correspondence reveals his growing conviction that Shepherd's Rest represented a threat that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities. I have requested federal assistance in determining appropriate legal frameworks for addressing phenomena that appear to challenge fundamental assumptions about human behavior and consciousness. The residents of Shepherd's Rest display coordinated activities and shared knowledge that suggest either elaborate fraud or genuine alterations in human cognitive function that have implications for territorial security and civil order. The federal government's response was swift, but carefully compartmentalized. In September 1863, a specialized team of investigators arrived in Santa Fe under the cover of assessing potential Confederate sympathies among territorial religious communities. The team was led by Colonel Marcus Whitfield, whose military background included experience with unusual phenomena encountered during operations in Indian Territory and classified incidents along the Mexican border. Colonel Whitfield's team represented a new type of federal response to situations that exceeded conventional military or civilian law enforcement capabilities. The unit included specialists in psychology, anthropology, and what were then called natural philosophy, early forms of scientific investigation that would later develop into formal disciplines. Their mission parameters, as revealed in documents declassified in 1963, included not only assessment and containment, but also preservation of evidence for further study. The colonel's classified reports, written in a style that combines military precision with scientific observation, provide the most detailed official documentation of what federal investigators discovered at Shepherd's Rest. Initial reconnaissance conducted from concealed observation points on the surrounding canyon walls revealed a community that exhibits several characteristics consistent with religious extremism, but also phenomena that exceed conventional parameters for human behavior and environmental interaction. Colonel Whitfield's military experience had prepared him for many forms of unconventional warfare, but the observations recorded by his team challenged assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Surveillance conducted over multiple 24-hour periods documented daily activities that follow patterns unrelated to practical necessity or conventional religious observance. Community members move in formations that maximize geometric precision rather than efficiency, with individuals positioned according to mathematical relationships that serve no apparent functional purpose. The team's scientific equipment, advanced for the 1860s, documented phenomena that would challenge understanding for decades to come. Temperature measurements reveal thermal anomalies throughout the settlement area, with ground temperatures varying according to geometric patterns that correspond to the positioning of buildings and the movement patterns of residents. Electromagnetic readings taken with experimental apparatus provided by the War Department's Technical Division show field variations that suggest influences beyond normal terrestrial magnetism. Most disturbing were the behavioral observations that suggested the Shepherd's Rest community had evolved beyond the boundaries of individual human consciousness. Extended surveillance revealed that community members maintain coordinated activities across distances that prevent normal communication methods. Individuals working in separate locations demonstrate synchronized timing and coordinated responses to environmental changes that occur simultaneously throughout the settlement, regardless of visual or auditory contact, between participants. Colonel Whitfield's team documented specific incidents that defied conventional explanation. On September 19th, we observed a resident working in the eastern agricultural area suddenly cease his activities and begin walking toward the central building. Simultaneously, 17 other community members throughout the settlement stopped their various tasks and began moving in the same direction, all maintaining identical pace and posture. No signal or communication had been observed that could account for this coordinated behavior. The colonel's scientific training led him to approach these phenomena with methodical observation, despite their challenging implications. We attempted to identify environmental factors that might explain the synchronized behavior, including atmospheric pressure changes, electromagnetic variations, or subsonic sound transmission. All measurements remained within normal parameters during the observed incidents, suggesting that the coordination operates through mechanisms beyond current scientific understanding. On the night of September 21st, coinciding with the autumn equinox, Colonel Whitfield's surveillance teams observed a ceremony that would become the focal point of federal concern about Shepherd's Rest for decades to come. The entire community emerged from their dwellings at precisely sunset, carrying objects that appeared to be geometric constructions made from metal, bone, and organic materials. Our equipment could not identify from our observation distance of approximately 800 feet. The ceremony itself followed patterns that suggested extensive preparation and rehearsal, yet proceeded with a spontaneity that indicated deeper coordination between participants. The residents arranged themselves in complex geometric patterns around the central plaza, with each individual positioned according to calculations that must have required considerable mathematical sophistication to determine. The geometric constructions were placed at specific points within these patterns, creating what appeared to be a three-dimensional mandala of extraordinary complexity. Colonel Whitfield's team attempted to document the ceremony using the most advanced recording equipment available to military units in 1863, but encountered technical difficulties that suggested interference from unknown sources. Photographic equipment malfunctioned repeatedly during crucial moments, producing images that showed severe distortions and anomalous light phenomena. Our experimental sound recording apparatus captured audio that, when played back, produced immediate adverse psychological effects in all personnel who heard the playback. What the surveillance team witnessed during the height of the ceremony challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of physical reality. At approximately midnight, the geometric constructions began to emit phosphorescent light that intensified until the entire valley was illuminated with cold, blue-white radiance. This illumination revealed structures and formations that had not been visible during daylight reconnaissance, including what appeared to be additional buildings constructed from materials that reflected the strange light in ways that violated optical principles. The colonel's report documented phenomena that military science could not adequately explain. Several community members appeared to undergo physical transformations during the ritual, with their forms becoming indistinct and fluid, as if shifting between states of matter. Others seemed to develop additional appendages or sensory organs that functioned independently of their normal anatomy. Most disturbing was the appearance of entities that had not been present at the ceremony's beginning, figures of considerable size that moved among the congregation but cast no shadows despite the intense illumination. The acoustic phenomena associated with the ceremony proved particularly challenging to document and analyze. The community's vocalizations created harmonic patterns that our equipment recorded, but which defied linguistic or musical analysis. When these recordings were reviewed by specialists in Washington, several listeners experienced immediate psychological distress, including hallucinations, temporary paralysis, and in one documented case, a catatonic state that persisted for 6 days. Colonel Whitfield noted that exposure to the acoustic recordings produced measurable changes in brain function that persisted long after the sound exposure ended. Electroencephalograph measurements of affected personnel showed alterations in neural activity patterns that resembled those observed in subjects experiencing profound religious experiences or psychotic episodes. However, the affected individuals maintained rational thought processes while reporting enhanced sensory perception and awareness of what they described as vast intelligences, observing from dimensions adjacent to normal reality. The federal investigation team attempted direct approach to Shepherd's Rest on September 23, but encountered obstacles that suggested the community had developed defensive capabilities beyond conventional understanding. We discovered that the canyon entrance had been blocked by what appeared to be a natural rockfall, despite our reconnaissance confirming clear access just 2 days previously. Local Apache guides, whose knowledge of the terrain spans generations, insisted that no such obstruction had ever existed in that location. Geological assessment of the blockage revealed anomalies that challenged conventional understanding of rock formation processes. The obstruction consisted of stone that matched the surrounding canyon walls in composition, but showed crystalline structures that could not have formed through natural weathering or seismic activity. The arrangement of the fallen rocks created acoustic properties that amplified certain sound frequencies, while completely blocking others, suggesting intentional engineering rather than random collapse. Colonel Whitfield's team attempted alternative approaches to the settlement, including scaling the canyon walls and approaching from above, but encountered psychological effects that prevented successful penetration of the valley. Personnel attempting descent into the valley reported severe disorientation, vertigo, and auditory hallucinations that intensified with proximity to the settlement. These effects were consistent across all team members regardless of their previous experience with difficult terrain or combat stress. The psychological effects experienced by federal personnel provided crucial insights into the nature of Shepherd's Rest's defenses. Affected individuals described experiencing waking nightmares that seemed to project directly into their consciousness, featuring geometric patterns, incomprehensible vocalizations, and contact with entities claiming to represent humanity's evolutionary destiny. These experiences were sufficiently vivid and disturbing that several team members required medical evacuation and extended psychological treatment. Dr. Whitmore, who had maintained sporadic contact with Shepherd's Rest throughout 1863, made one final visit to the community in early October at considerable personal risk. His journal entry from this visit provides the last first-hand civilian account of the settlement and offers crucial insight into the final stages of whatever transformation was occurring within the valley. I arrived to find Shepherd's Rest transformed beyond recognition into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about architecture, physics, and human habitation. The buildings now incorporated design elements that seemed to exist partially in dimensions beyond normal spatial relationships, with walls that curved through impossible angles and doorways that appeared larger from the inside than their external dimensions could accommodate. Dr. Whitmore's medical training led him to document the physical changes in residents with scientific precision, despite his mounting horror. The transformation in the community members has progressed far beyond the anomalies I previously observed. Their eyes now emit a faint bioluminescence visible in dim lighting conditions. Their movements display perfect synchronization across the entire population, and they communicate through methods that seem to bypass spoken language entirely. The doctor's account reveals the extent to which the residents had been altered by their exposure to whatever forces Thorne had awakened. Individual consciousness appears to have been subsumed into a collective awareness that maintains the personalities and memories of the original individuals while integrating them into a unified intelligence of extraordinary capability. When I spoke with Sarah Henderson, she responded with her characteristic warmth and recognition, but also with knowledge and perspectives that could only have come from simultaneous awareness of every other resident's experiences and thoughts. Dr. Whitmore documented his conversation with Reverend Thorne during this final visit, providing crucial insight into Thorne's ultimate objectives and the true nature of the intelligence he served. Thorne greeted me with warmth and apparent genuine affection, yet his physical form has become less substantial, as if he exists only partially within normal reality. When he spoke, his words carried harmonic overtones that resonated not just in my auditory system, but throughout my entire nervous system, inducing states of consciousness I lack adequate vocabulary to describe. The Reverend's explanation of the community's transformation revealed the cosmic scope of the agenda that Shepherd's Rest served. Thorne spoke of entities he called the Ancient Shepherds, beings whose consciousness spans dimensions, and whose existence predates the formation of our solar system. He claimed that these entities had been guiding human evolution for millennia, preparing our species for the moment when we could serve as suitable vessels for their direct participation in material reality. Dr. Whitmore recorded Thorne's description of the transformation process with scientific detail despite his growing comprehension of its horrifying implications. The Reverend explained that human consciousness in its normal state operates within severe limitations that prevent awareness of the universe's true nature. Through the techniques he had developed, supposedly revealed through direct communication with the ancient shepherds, these limitations could be transcended, allowing human minds to expand beyond individual identity into participation in cosmic intelligence networks. The doctor's account reveals the seductive nature of the promises that had attracted Shepherd's Rest residents to their ultimate fate. Thorne described the transformed state as a form of immortality that preserved individual personality while providing access to knowledge and capabilities that spanned galactic distances and geological timescales. He claimed that death, disease, and the psychological suffering that defines human existence would become irrelevant for those who underwent the complete transformation. Dr. Whitmore was shown the lower chambers of the central building during this final visit, spaces that provided crucial evidence about the methods Thorne employed to achieve his objectives. The excavated areas now extend far deeper into the Earth than the original construction could have accommodated, connecting to natural cavern systems that Thorne claimed provided access to dimensional interfaces where communication with the ancient shepherds was most effective. The underground chambers had been modified with architectural elements that challenged conventional understanding of construction and engineering. The walls are covered with symbols that seem to shift and change configuration when observed directly, creating optical effects that induce alterations in consciousness within moments of exposure. The acoustic properties of these spaces create resonances that affect brainwave patterns in ways that promote receptivity to influences that originate from sources beyond normal human perception. Dr. Whitmore's final observations document the ultimate horror of what had occurred at Shepherd's Rest. I realized with mounting dread that the residents had not simply adopted unusual religious practices or developed enhanced cognitive abilities. They had been transformed into something fundamentally different from human beings, entities that retained human memories and personalities, while serving purposes that originated from intelligences whose agenda included the systematic alteration of human consciousness on a species-wide scale. The doctor's departure from Shepherd's Rest was accompanied by warnings that proved prophetic. As I prepared to leave, Reverend Thorne expressed regret that I had not chosen to join his community in their sacred work, but assured me that I would eventually understand the necessity of what was occurring. He explained that the transformation of Shepherd's Rest was merely the first stage of a process that would eventually encompass all human consciousness, whether through willing participation or involuntary conversion. Dr. Whitmore's journal entries ceased abruptly after his return from this final visit, though his wife's diary provides disturbing details about his condition during his final weeks of life. Samuel has become increasingly withdrawn and distracted since his return from that terrible place. He spends hours staring toward the mountains where that community lies hidden, muttering phrases in languages I have never heard. Sometimes I find him drawing geometric patterns that seem to writhe and shift when I look at them directly. The doctor's widow reported that her husband's final days were marked by behavior that suggested ongoing influence from his exposure to Shepherd's Rest phenomena. He claimed to be receiving communications from the residents of that community, messages that arrived not through normal sensory channels, but through what he called dimensional resonance. These communications apparently provided information about events occurring at great distances and predictions about future developments that proved remarkably accurate. Dr. Whitmore died in his sleep on November 14, 1863, just days before the final disappearance of Shepherd's Rest itself. The autopsy, conducted by territorial authorities and later reviewed by federal investigators, revealed no apparent medical cause of death. However, post-mortem examination of brain tissue showed unusual neural structures that resembled the modifications observed in other individuals exposed to Shepherd's Rest phenomena. The disappearance of Shepherd's Rest occurred during the week of November 18 through November 25, 1863, coinciding with astronomical events that included a lunar eclipse and unusual planetary alignments that would not recur for several centuries. Apache scouts stationed on distant peaks reported observing intense lights emanating from the hidden valley for 7 consecutive nights, accompanied by sounds they described as the earth itself screaming in languages older than human speech. The phenomena observed during this final week exceeded anything previously documented by federal surveillance teams or civilian witnesses. The illumination visible from the valley intensified each night, reaching levels that made observation difficult even from distances of several miles. The acoustic phenomena could be detected at ranges that exceeded normal sound transmission limits, suggesting that the effects were propagating through medium other than normal atmospheric pressure waves. Joseph Crow Feather, the Apache elder whose tribal memories included warnings about the Cursed Valley, provided the most detailed account of the final phenomena to ethnographers decades later. The lights that came from that place during those 7 nights were not like any fire or lightning our people had ever seen. They moved with purpose, forming patterns in the sky that hurt the mind to follow. The sounds that accompanied them spoke of things that should not exist in a world where human beings must live and die. The tribal elder's account included details that proved consistent with federal observations. On the final night, the entire valley seemed to pulse with light that revealed structures and movements that had not been visible during previous observations. The canyon walls themselves appeared to become transparent, allowing observers to see vast chambers and passages that extended deep into the earth. Within these spaces, figures moved in formations that followed geometric patterns of impossible complexity. The climactic event occurred during the early hours of November 25th, when a massive seismic disturbance struck the region with effects that were recorded by primitive monitoring equipment as far away as Colorado and Texas. The earthquake registered intensities that caused structural damage in Santa Fe and Las Vegas, but the epicenter's effects exceeded anything in geological records. Colonel Whitfield's final report describes the seismic event from the perspective of federal observers positioned at maximum safe distance from the valley. The earthquake began with preliminary tremors that followed rhythmic patterns rather than the random intervals characteristic of natural seismic activity. The main event consisted of a single, massive displacement that appeared to originate from directly beneath the Shepherd's Rest settlement rather than from deep tectonic sources. The immediate aftermath of the earthquake revealed that the valley had undergone changes that defied geological explanation. When investigation teams reached the site, we discovered that the entire canyon had been filled with debris that appeared to consist of solid bedrock rather than loose material from landslides or rockfalls. The consistency and composition of this fill material suggested that the valley floor had been raised to the level of the surrounding terrain through processes that operated far more rapidly than natural geological forces could accomplish. Federal investigators attempted to determine whether any trace remained of the settlement or its residents, but found no evidence that Shepherd's Rest had ever existed. Excavation attempts encountered rock formations of extraordinary hardness that resisted even explosive charges. Core samples revealed mineral compositions that included elements not found in regional geological surveys, arranged in crystalline structures that suggested artificial rather than natural formation processes. The official federal report classified the incident as a natural disaster, with Shepherd's Rest listed among frontier communities destroyed by seismic activity. However, classified documentation reveals that authorities continued monitoring the site for decades, recording phenomena that suggested the story was far from complete. Seismic monitoring stations established in the area detected regular vibrations emanating from beneath the sealed valley, patterns that followed mathematical sequences rather than the random intervals characteristic of natural geological processes. These vibrations occurred at specific times that corresponded to astronomical events and followed frequencies that matched harmonic patterns recorded during observations of Shepherd's Rest ceremonies. Temperature measurements revealed that the ground above the former settlement remained consistently warmer than surrounding areas, despite the lack of any known geothermal activity in the region. Thermal imaging conducted by military aircraft in the 1920s showed geometric heat patterns beneath the surface that suggested artificial structures continuing to operate despite being buried under hundreds of feet of solid rock. Most disturbing were the psychological effects reported by federal personnel assigned to monitor the site over the following decades. Rangers, surveyors, and military observers consistently reported vivid dreams that followed identical patterns regardless of the individual's background or previous knowledge of the Shepherd's Rest incident. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a military psychiatrist who treated affected personnel during the 1920s, documented consistent elements in these dream experiences. Patients described nocturnal visions that progress through identifiable stages, beginning with exposure to complex geometric patterns that seem to teach mathematical concepts beyond current human understanding. These progress to direct communication with intelligences that identify themselves as shepherds, guiding human consciousness toward evolutionary transformation. The psychiatrist's analysis revealed disturbing implications about the long-term effects of exposure to the shepherd's rest site. The affected individuals report that these dream communications provide specific instructions for techniques that could be used to expand human consciousness beyond normal limitations. Several patients have demonstrated enhanced cognitive abilities following their exposure, including improved pattern recognition, mathematical calculation, and what appears to be limited telepathic capability. Archaeological investigation of the site proved impossible due to the complete nature of the geological changes, but advanced ground-penetrating radar conducted in 1955 revealed structures beneath the sealed valley that challenged understanding of the incident's true nature. The images showed what appeared to be intact buildings and chamber systems extending far deeper than the original settlement could have reached, suggesting that Shepherd's Rest had undergone extensive expansion before its disappearance. Analysis of the radar data revealed architectural features that seemed to exist in spatial relationships that violated conventional geometric principles. The underground structures displayed dimensional properties that our equipment cannot accurately measure or map. Chambers appear to be both larger and smaller than their surrounding spaces, with connecting passages that seem to curve through more than 3 spatial dimensions. Spectroscopic analysis of mineral samples recovered from the sealed area revealed compositions that included rare earth elements not found naturally in the regional geology. These materials were arranged in precise geometric patterns that suggested deliberate placement according to mathematical principles that exceeded contemporary scientific understanding. The fate of Shepherd's Rest remained officially classified until partial declassification in 1963, though even then, substantial portions of the documentation were heavily redacted to protect information deemed sensitive to national security. The released files revealed that similar phenomena had been reported at multiple sites across the American frontier, always associated with charismatic religious leaders who gathered followers in isolated locations and practiced rituals that combined Christian elements with far older traditions. Federal investigators had identified a pattern suggesting that individuals like Ezekiel Thorne represented agents in a coordinated agenda rather than isolated religious fanatics. References in various classified reports mention communities in Oregon, California, Utah, and Texas that had exhibited similar characteristics before disappearing under mysterious circumstances that local authorities attributed to natural disasters or Indian attacks. The scope of this apparent coordinated activity emerged from analysis of commonalities between different incidents. All affected communities were established in geographical locations that shared specific characteristics, including proximity to underground water sources, unusual mineral deposits, and terrain features that created natural acoustic amplification. The leaders demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters, and the transformation processes they implemented followed identical patterns regardless of regional or cultural differences. Colonel Whitfield's final assessment, included in documents not declassified until 1975, provided a chilling evaluation of the implications for national security and human civilization. Based on accumulated evidence from this and related incidents, I must conclude that we are confronting phenomena that represent a systematic effort to alter human consciousness on a species-wide scale. The entities referenced by Thorne and similar figures appear to possess capabilities that exceed current scientific understanding and agenda that extend far beyond conventional religious or political objectives. The Colonel's recommendations reflected the federal government's recognition that conventional military or law enforcement responses would prove inadequate. All sites associated with these phenomena should be sealed and monitored indefinitely using the most advanced detection equipment available. Personnel exposure should be minimized and limited to individuals who have demonstrated psychological resistance to the documented effects. Any evidence of similar activities should be reported immediately through classified channels to prevent local authorities from inadvertently facilitating the spread of these transformative influences. Modern investigations of the Shepherd's Rest incident have been hampered by continued classification of key documents and the reluctance of federal agencies to acknowledge the true nature of what occurred. However, available evidence suggests that Ezekiel Thorne successfully established contact with intelligences whose agenda included the systematic modification of human consciousness to serve purposes that originated beyond terrestrial concerns. Recent developments have added urgency to questions about the long-term implications of the Shepherd's Rest incident. Seismic monitoring stations have recorded increasing activity beneath the sealed valley since 2010, with vibration patterns that match historical data from the 1860s. Ground temperature measurements show progressive warming that suggests renewed activity in whatever remains of the underground structures. Most concerning are reports from researchers and hikers who have experienced psychological effects similar to those documented in historical accounts. These individuals report dreams and waking visions that follow progression patterns identical to those experienced by 19th-century witnesses, suggesting that whatever intelligence Thorne awakened at Shepherd's Rest continues to influence human consciousness from its sealed location. The true significance of Shepherd's Rest extends beyond the fate of 73 frontier settlers who sought religious fulfillment in the high desert of New Mexico territory. The incident represents evidence that human consciousness may be subject to manipulation by intelligences whose capabilities and agenda exceed anything in conventional understanding of reality. As one survivor of a similar incident wrote in a letter discovered in federal archives decades later, "We believed we were seeking God's truth, but discovered that truth itself may be far more malleable than human minds can safely comprehend. What we encountered offered everything we desired: knowledge that transcended earthly limitations, power over the forces that constrain mortal existence, and unity of purpose that eliminated the isolation and confusion that plague individual consciousness. The price demanded was nothing less than transformation into instruments serving agenda that span scales of time and space beyond human imagination." The sealed valley that once held Shepherd's Rest remains under federal protection to this day, surrounded by restricted airspace and protected by environmental regulations that prevent civilian access. Official explanations cite geological instability and endangered species protection, but classified documents suggest more fundamental concerns about what might emerge if containment measures fail. For those who study the incident from historical records, the coordinates of Shepherd's Rest can be determined from territorial surveys, though reaching the site requires crossing federal land protected by laws that carry severe penalties for unauthorized access. The few researchers who have obtained official permission to study the area report that it remains one of the most psychologically disturbing locations in North America, where the boundary between consensus reality and nightmare becomes disturbingly permeable. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Shepherd's Rest incident is not what happened to those who followed Ezekiel Thorne into the desert, but the implications for humanity's future development. If the intelligence that guided Thorne represents one component of a coordinated effort to transform human consciousness, then the sealed valley may contain not the remnants of a failed experiment, but the seed of a transformation that awaits optimal conditions for renewed growth. In a universe where consciousness itself may be subject to influences from intelligences whose existence transcends physical limitations, the question becomes not whether we are alone in the cosmos, but whether we will remain recognizably human when we discover the true nature of those who have been guiding our species' development from realms beyond the reach of conventional understanding.